access in the United States. It's heavily instrumented, and the data that are collected there are freely available. So it makes it a really good site for us to develop these benchmarks from. In addition to that, it's in the U.S. Great Plains, so the terrain is fairly simple. So whenever you don't have weather events, then you have an atmosphere that responds really strongly to the radiative forcings. And so if we want to look at how wakes develop and recover under neutral, unstable, and stable conditions in the atmosphere, it's a really good site to look at that. Doesn't have any influence from complex terrain or obstacles around. So this here shows you the layout of the site and the instruments that we're going to be using for the benchmark. So the data are collected upstream of the wind turbine with a mat tower that measures the inflow when the flow is from the south. And then we're going to be focusing on one of the three turbines, which is a modified Vestas V27. And then on the nacelle of this turbine, there is a DTU spinner lidar. So that's a scanning lidar that's facing the rear of the turbine and scanning the wake between 1D and 5D downstream. And so these are the three sets of data that we're going to be using for the definition of this benchmark. And the way that we came up with this definition is that we went through, NREL and Sandia went through all of the data that had been collected during the wake steering experiment. And then we aggregated those data based on how similar they were in terms of the atmospheric inflow, the turbine operation, and the wake measurements that were available. So in terms of the atmospheric wind flow, we consider the hub height wind speed and turbulence intensity, the shear, all of these estimated from that upstream mat tower, the veer, and also the Obukov length from the lowest sonic measurement in the mat mast. We also looked at yaw offset. We wanted that to be as small as possible, and at the wake measurements that were available during the period. So we wanted each benchmark to have a similar measurement strategy, and also the quality of the retrieval. So the return signals had to be good. And so we got the data that had similar inflow, similar turbine operation, and similar measurement strategy, and used those to define each of the benchmarks. So here, the objective is to take advantage of these clear diurnal cycles that we observe at SWiFT to evaluate the ability of various models to simulate the behavior of wakes under these different stratified atmospheric conditions. So these are the three benchmarks that we are defining. So there's one during daytime unstable conditions, there's a transition nearly neutral period, and then a nighttime very stable atmosphere. And during the unstable period, we have a measurement strategy that is higher frequency. So the lidar is measuring at only one distance downstream of the turbine. So the retrievals of an entire plane of data are every about 2 seconds or so. So this is the highest frequency that we have. And so the focus of this one unstable benchmark is on wake dynamics. And by that, we mean phenomena that are driven by turbulence. And then the other two benchmarks, the nearly neutral one and the nighttime one, the measurement strategy is different. So instead of focusing at only one distance downstream, the lidar is actually measuring at 7 distances downstream. So as a result of that, the measurements are lower frequency at any given distance downstream, so about 25 seconds. And here we're going to focus on wake evolution. And we use this term to think of how the wake expands and recovers and propagates in the downstream direction in space. In this exercise, of course, we also consider wake dynamics, but the measurement frequency is slower. And so this slide here gives you an overview of what the conditions are like in terms of inflow and the measurements that are being used. There is a lot more detail in the documentation of the benchmarks that you will have links for later in this presentation. So this is just to give you an idea of what the turbulence intensity and the shear looks like, the Obukhov length for the unstable, the neutral, and the stable cases. So as I mentioned before, the unstable one, we have these measurements at only one distance downstream, so that's 3 rotor diameters downstream. We will still be comparing model-to-model results for all the other distances downstream, but in terms of comparison to the measurements, it's going to focus on 3D. And we have 50 minutes of measurement data for this case. For the other 2 cases, we have 60 minutes of measurements. And even though we have measurements in the wake starting at 1 rotor diameter downstream, it's a little hard to identify the wake when it's really close to the rotors. So the comparison to measurements will primarily focus on the distances 2 to 5D downstream. So where are we in terms of status? So this timeline here shows you how long the benchmark's going to run for and what the different phases are. So we are at the very beginning. So this is the kickoff meeting for these 3 benchmarks. And the idea is that the entire exercise will last about 6 months. It's open to all of the participants of this IA Wind Test 31, and it's also open to all models. So later when you go through the documentation in more detail, you're going to see that there are specific guidelines sometimes for if you have just a steady state model or a time-stepping model, and that's also reflected in the files that we're going to ask for each model to submit whenever they have a new iteration of results. But basically, if you have a time-step model, we ask you to run your model to convergence. So maybe depending on the benchmark that you're simulating or your model, that's going to mean a different length of simulation time, and you can define that yourself. And other things pertaining to the configuration of the model are also left to the discretion of the participants, like domain size, grid spacing, time step. All of these things are things that you can tweak during the first phase of the benchmark that I'll describe in the next slide. And then the idea is that after we do this entire exercise and do the model intercomparison and do the model comparison to the measurements, then is to have the multi-model benchmark results published in a journal article and co-authored by every participant that chooses to release their results and chooses to participate in the publication effort. So a little more detail about each of these phases. We are starting phase 1 right now. So phase 1 is where you have an opportunity to calibrate your models before we start doing the blind comparison. So here we're not looking at the wake simulation at all, and we're only looking at the atmospheric inflow and how the turbine responds to that atmospheric inflow. So we are providing the turbine model and the mean atmospheric state for each of those 3 benchmarks, and we request that each participant submit the simulation setup for their model, the flow upstream of the turbine, and the turbine response. And so here's where you have the opportunity to calibrate your model to make sure that the turbine's responding how it should, and that the inflow is matching the specified conditions for each of the benchmarks. After phase 1, we move on to the blind comparison phase. So that phase has 2 different parts to it. The first part is a code-to-code comparison. And so no measurement data are involved, and the objective is to identify potential errors in the model configuration. So here, when we compare models to one another, if there's anything really jarring that stands out and how one model is not performing like the others are, then you have a chance to address that before we start the comparison with the measurements. And then this comparison to measurements is the part 2 of phase 2. And here is where we provide a first assessment of the skill of the simulation tool. And then finally, there is a third phase called iteration, where participants have the chance to interrogate their results, and collectively we try to understand where the models work well, where they don't, where we should target our improvement efforts to these models in the future. So the supporting models that we're going to provide are the wind turbine models. We have a GitHub repository that we have set up for this benchmark. And so all of the code and the models that you're going to use can be found in this GitHub repository. And we have a FAST7 model that Sandia has put together that's ready for release, and also an OpenFast model. So that's the current version of FAST. So it's similar to the FAST version 8. And we're also providing performance curves. So if you're using a lower fidelity model and don't necessarily have a complex wind turbine model that you can use for your simulation tool. And then on top of that, we are going to provide the LiDAR scanning geometry. So you don't need this now for this phase 1. So this hasn't been released yet, but this will be released by Sandia before the start of phase 2. And the idea is that participants will have a chance to code up some sort of LiDAR sampling strategy to their simulation tool, so that they can have the virtual LiDAR simulated values as well, to compare that to the full field simulation, and to also help in the validation effort, the comparison with the measurements. So the next steps now, the first one is to sign up to participate in these benchmarks. So as a participant, what you do is sign up with a Google form. So there's a link to it right here on these slides, and these slides are released in the formal documentation for the benchmark. So you're going to see this link in many of the pages that we refer you to. But basically, this form is going to ask you for contact information. What's your institution? What are the points of contact for your benchmark results? And it's also going to ask you for information about the flow model that you're going to use and the turbine model that you're going to use. And then your benchmark plans, whether you plan to participate only in the neutral or in all of them. And then as organizers here at NREL and Sandia, we're going to assign you a participant ID, and we're going to create a private secure box in the cloud where you can upload your results, so that only the benchmark organizers have access to it and no one else. And also when you sign up, you have the option to specify if you want your results to remain private and your participant ID to remain private, and we can work with that as well. Step number 2 is familiarize yourself with the benchmarks. So there are all these links here that you can follow. What we're giving in this presentation is just a really basic overview of what the benchmarks are going to be. There's a lot more information on this Read the Docs page that you can see the link for on the slide. The benchmarks over there are defined, and also there is a schedule of the upcoming meetings. We're going to try and have regular meetings during this phase 1, probably once a month. And then, as I mentioned before, we also have a GitHub page. So this GitHub page, it of course hosts the documentation that you find in the Read the Docs, but also most relevant, it has examples of files which are requested from the participants for the benchmark. It has all of the code that will be used to analyze the simulation data. And it also has those wind turbine models and performance curves that I mentioned before. We also have a Q&A forum. So this wind.nrel.gov is a forum maintained by NREL, and we have created a thread over there for the SWiFT benchmarks. And so you can sign up for the forum, make a username, and then we ask that when you have questions about the benchmarks, you post them over there so that if other people have the same question, they can just refer back to the forum. And then we also have a short story at the Wind Vein blog that Javier maintains as the formal release of this benchmark. And then finally, after signing up and becoming more familiar with the benchmarks, you're ready to start your simulations. Hopefully we have provided all the data that you need, but if we have forgotten something or if there's something that doesn't make sense, just post it in the forum and we'll address it. If you have a different type of model that needs to submit different types of file formats or something like that, just post it in there and we'll try and make it as flexible as possible. But otherwise, we ask that you try to observe the file formats that we are requesting. We have provided in the documentation and the GitHub repository example templates for all of the files that we are requesting. And the templates are, of course, because they're in the repository, they are reduced versions of what you're actually going to be submitting. But they're pretty straightforward. And so there are basically 3 different types of files that we are asking for. One of them is a simulation setup file. So here it's a YAML file, so it's a markup language that you can just define all of the relevant inputs and parameters for your model. So we have put an example in there, but clearly you're going to have to modify depending on what your model is and what kind of inputs are relevant for it. And then we ask that at each time that you submit new results from your simulations, you just update that file so we know what the configuration is that you used in your latest simulations. And then a second type of file is whenever there's flow data. So for the atmosphere or for the wake, we are asking NetCDF format. So if you are not familiar with NetCDF, we also have put in the repository an example Python code. It's a Jupyter notebook that shows you how to write out your data in this NetCDF format. And then for the turbine response, we are asking for just normal text files. Yeah, so that's pretty straightforward as well. And we have 2 examples in the GitHub repository, one for time stepping tools and one for steady state tools. And then finally, a couple remarks about the data analysis. For consistency, we are doing all of the processing of the submitted data ourselves, the benchmark organizers. And we are asking for you to submit just raw flow data so that there's the least amount of uncertainty in the simulated results comparison. But also for transparency and for repeatability, all of the code that we use to process these data will be publicly released in this repository. And so the measurements will also be publicly released. And so you'll be able to redo this analysis when all these things have been released. And like I mentioned before, if any information is missing or contradictory, just post in the forum. Or if it's anything very specific to your needs in your simulation tool, you can also send an email directly to me or to Pat. All right, so that was it. This is the summary of the next steps. Just sign up, familiarize yourself with the benchmarks, and then you're ready to start the simulations. As I mentioned, we're trying to have monthly meetings at least for this first phase to see how everyone's coming along and if there are things that we forgot to define, if anything needs tweaking. So we are hoping to have the next meeting on November 27th. And then we can also increase the frequency of these meetings as it comes close to the end of phase 1. And so that's it. I'm going to open up for questions. And yeah, thank you for participating.
So any questions for Paula? Okay, well, I guess if there are no questions, everything must have been fairly clear. We will post this presentation online, and there's, of course, a lot of information to absorb. So as Paula mentioned, feel free to ask questions in the forum or to us directly in the future. And maybe one last chance for any questions at all.
Make sure you unmute yourself if you have a question.
Oh yeah.
Hey, Paula, I have a question. This is Tony.
All right.
Until when can users sign up?
That's a good question. Until as long as they need to submit everything by the end of phase 1. So the end of the first phase is December 21st. So if they think they can generate the inflow conditions really quickly and use the fast models without tweaking anything, then they can sign up until, a couple weeks before, as long as they get the model results by the end of the phase 1, it's all right. But we encourage people to sign up soon so that they have time to submit more than one iterations of their results.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Anything else?
Where are these slides going to be?
The slides are already in this in the Read the Docs page. So
Okay.
if you go to the Read the Docs in the landing page, there's like download the release slides. There's a link.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we can also modify the wind vane blog to link to that too.
Hi, Paul and Ben. This is Soren. What about the controller of the turbine? Is that an integrated part of the FAST model, or will that be released as a separate entity?
Well, so far, this is Emmanuel here. So far, the controller is not part of the model. And I don't know if it will be.
Okay.
But we can try. We can investigate, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a question for Sandia. If there's any Sandia folks on the phone that can comment on that.
David Maniaci, looks like you're on the phone.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we've included the baseline controller, but it doesn't have the all controller aspects or the real controller. And I'll have to check on what parts we're actually releasing from the real controller that's used on the turbine. It's not the original V27 controller. It's heavily modified. So I know some parts of it we could release at least as a black box, but there's no plan to do that as part of this benchmark, since the basic fast simple controller is sufficient for the cases that we are using for the benchmark. All the cases are in region 2. So.
And this is Tommy. The torque constant in the simple controller was matched against experimental data to match the RPM rates across the wind speeds of region 2.
All right,
Yes.
good.
Yeah, so the V27, Fast 7, and the Open Fast models include those tuned torque constants. And the blade pitch was also tuned to the observed cases, but it's the average over the cases rather than tuned to any specific case.
Okay, good question. Anything else on your minds?
And I just wanted to add, Chris Kelly at Sandia here wrote a report on how we tuned the fast model for those two constants.
And you can, the report is also linked in the read the docs, so you can, once you go through on the read the docs, there's a part of it called the benchmark simulations, and when you get to the section on the turbine information, there should be a link to that report there as well. You can just download it.
And last call for questions. Okay. Well, we can end the meeting earlier then. So best of luck reading through all the documentation and getting your simulations started. And we look forward to hearing how everyone's doing through the forum or in our next meeting in a month. So thanks for joining, and we'll talk to y'all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat and Paula.
Bye.